A common technique for optimizing a heavy application is to break it up into smaller modules or pieces that get loaded lazily or when the user requests it. So imagine you have an application that has, let's say, 20 features, and your entire payload is massive. That I've seen applications sometimes being 20 megabytes large, very, very large. And unfortunately, the first time you go to an application like this, you have to download the entire payload to make that work. And so somebody is waiting a very long time for the application to just even do its first meaningful content paint and for it to render. And so the idea is, what if we only loaded the pieces that we needed when we needed them? And so a strategy for this, or how you approach this, is going to depend on your circumstances and, more importantly, on your user's behavior. So for instance, if you have an application that has 5 features and your users spend 90% of their time in 2 of those features, I would recommend loading those in the initial bundle. But if the other 10% of their time is spent randomly accessing the other 3 features, then you could, 1, break those 3 up into a second module or into individual modules. So then you have your initial module and maybe 3 other smaller modules. And so this really is going to depend on how your users use your application and where kind of the behavior is distributed across your entire feature. So you could split it up in half. You could do a lazy module for each. The one thing that I do want to point out that most people will say, like, oh, well, the more modules, the better. That just makes sense, right? Well, especially in countries that have an underdeveloped infrastructure, like third world countries, or even if you're out in like a rural area and you are on a 3G network or something equivalent, the most expensive operation you can do on that device is to make an XHR call back to the server. The reason being is that unlike a computer, a phone has to activate hardware, ping the tower, do a handshake, then get the thing, and then complete it. And so in some cases, it is a lot better for the user to have a larger payload, but reduce the calls over the wire. So I just want to put that out there, that it is a balance, that making XHR calls to a server is also expensive. And if you're on a handheld device, it's very expensive. So depending on your user base, you may want to factor that in. So with that said, let's talk about how to implement a lazy module. And so I'm going to go into the code and I'm going to walk through some code that I have preemptively generated and just show you what we are starting with. So when you are lazy loading a module, naturally you need a module. And so this looks exactly like any other module that we would create. So very similar to our app module. And you'll notice here that we have our component. We also have our lazy routing module. And if we step into this, then what you're going to see is that we have a route defined for our, think of this as a top level component, that we have a top level route for this particular module, as well as we're doing router module for child, because this is going to be added in as a child module, and we're not loading this into the root. And so this is very similar in structure philosophically to the app module over here, and its relationship to the app routing module. And so in order for this to work, we are going to create a route for this that's going to be a little different than anything we've seen up to this point. So we're going to create a path, and it's going to be lazy. And then from here, we are going to, instead of calling component, because there is not a component, we are going to instead call load children. And this is going to store a function. And so load children is essentially, when we go to this, that Angular under the hood is going to call load children and then execute the logic that we put into this particular function. And so from here, what we're going to do is we're going to import or call the import method, and we're going to give it a path to the module that we want to load. So in this case, it's examples, lazy module, module. So I feel like this is either a vocal warm-up, a tongue twister, or a funny joke, and at this point I'm trolling everybody. And then from here we are going to, because this is going to return a promise, we are going to resolve this using .then, and this is something I don't understand why they did it like this. Well, I believe the reason why it is a promise, once I think about it for like 2 seconds, is that this is only ever going to resolve once. And so a promise in this case, I believe, would make sense. And so from here, this is going to take in a single parameter, which is M for module, just as C is for cookie. That's good enough for me. And then we're going to define the module that we want to load. So in this case, it's pulling in the module, and then because within this module here, this is called lazy module, then it's going ahead and then essentially bootstrapping that module into the Angular runtime. And so just to recap before we check this out, same path. The difference is that we're giving it a function that when we call this, it's going to say load children, and it's going to import the module. And from here, then it's just going to return the module itself, the Angular module that we want to essentially instantiate or initialize or bootstrap into the runtime. So now if I go here and I go to lazy module, you'll see here that this is a lazy module. Now, one thing I do want to do is, let me go ahead and I'm going to just clear my cache, clear data. If we come back here and we go to the network tab, I'm going to refresh. And you'll notice here that one of the things that was loaded after it loaded everything else is this particular module. And so I think I can zoom this up just a bit without losing it, is that this is pulling this over the wire. So it's wrapping up this module, the lazy module, into a kind of a standalone separate module. And then when we request it, then it's pulling in the entire module over the wire and then loading it into the application. And so this is where if we built another one, or we had a number of lazy modules, every time you navigated to that lazy module, what you would see would be the bundle for that module coming over the wire. And so executing lazy modules or implementing them is fairly straightforward. You simply treat the piece that you want to isolate. So a lot of times this might be a standalone feature set, or even a bit of functionality that is, or a couple pieces of functionality, but these go into a module. And in a way, you have to treat that like almost like a separate application. And so a lot of times you'll have separate routes for it, a routing table, as well as one thing that you can run into problems is that within the module, if you have dependencies, you need to add those dependencies to that standalone module as well, so that when it's bundled, that it has the dependencies that it needs and it's not dependent on the parent module. So in this case, because I was using material within our lazy module, I needed to import that as well. And so this is how lazy modules work within an Angular application.